All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So our presenters get lined up. So thank you everybody for being here. I appreciate you all. My name is Cinnamon Moffett and I'm going to be your host for today's event. This is a hybrid event for the HMSC seminar. So that means we have folks online and folks in the room. Most of you have done this with me before, but if you're online, we ask that you put any questions you might have, technical questions you can't hear, you're not being able to see, or any questions for our presenters today into the chat box. And our volunteer Roseanne will read those out or help address those. So just feel free to communicate with us through the chat box. For folks in the room, we ask that if you have questions for today's speakers, you just raise your hand and I'll bring you this mic. Ooh. And then folks will be able to hear your questions online and feel engaged with us that way as well. But again, thank you all for being here. Wanted to make a couple of quick announcements and then I'll get right started with introductions to our team today. So our next seminar is May 15th. We have a special guest that's going to be here that was invited by our student organization. We have Edith Witter, who is a MacArthur Fellow and a recognized deep sea explorer and conservationist. We'll be talking about bioluminescence and beyond. She's going to be joining us remotely due to her schedule, but we're going to have on-site viewing. So if you want to come and join us, this should be an amazing talk with gorgeous video and footage. So I'm hoping you can come see it on the big screen, and that will be May 15th. If you are interested in any of the Hatfields events, you can find them on the Hatfields event page on our website. You can also find recordings for these past seminars. So if you're interested in this event or sharing it with others, you'll be able to get that information there. But I just want to jump right into the folks that are standing behind me and do a really quick introduction of our different presenters. And I'm going to do them in the order of my paper, which is not the order you're standing, which is going to be confusing for us all. But Julia Bingham is a postdoctoral scholar, thank you, at OSU School of Public Policy in the Pacific Marine Energy Center. Julia is an interdisciplinary marine social scientist interested in coastal governance and management and works with coastal communities on issues related to fisheries, renewable energy, and environmental justice. We have Hossain Taufiq, who is a PhD candidate with the Public Policy of Oregon State University. He's expected to graduate this spring. Congratulations. Next week is his defense. So if you want to learn more, his defense explores equity and governance in coastal energy development. Prior to his doctoral studies, he has studied all over the place and worked in social sciences around the world. So a great amount of information coming from Hossain. We have Emily. There's Emily. Emily Miller is a master's student in public policy at Oregon State University, where she researches community perceptions and benefits arrangements related to U.S. offshore wind development. She brings a background of planning, community engagement, and working with local equity initiatives in regional economic development in rural Oregon. And then online, see if it pop up. There she is. We have Lorren Ruscetta, who is the marine policy graduate student at the University of Delaware, who is a strong candidate, or sorry, has a strong background in social and behavioral sciences, including professional experience in conflict resolution. Last but not least, we have Greg. Greg Stelmach is a postdoctoral scholar with Oregon State University's School of Marine Policy and Marine I'm getting tired of reading. Pacific Marine Energy Center. He has spent years researching community responses to energy infrastructure projects, including liquefied natural gas, wave energy, and offshore wind. And I am so excited that they are all here and they're going to share their research with us. So we give them all a round of applause and I'll hand the mic off.
Thank you, Cinnamon. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for coming here in person and online. I'm Greg. I'm happy to be joined by my team. We're going to talk about research we've been doing around community benefits and impacts of offshore wind development. I see some friendly faces, familiar faces in the room who have been following this a lot, just like us, but some of you haven't. So just a little bit of background before we get going. So why are we even talking about offshore wind? It was a major push of the previous administration, Biden administration, and a lot of it is there's a high technical capacity for offshore wind in the U.S. There's an NREL report a couple of years ago that found there's almost 3 times the annual electricity consumption in the U.S. could be produced from offshore wind, which is important because energy demand in the U.S. is going up drastically with AI and data centers. It's also offshore wind is a very complementary load profile to solar production. Um, it's about 10 years or so, a little more than a decade in the works. And so there's a little over 40 leases across the U.S., but they're primarily on the East Coast. The 4 active wind farms are on the East Coast. And that's because of the continental shelf. On the East Coast, they can do fixed bottom technology, which can just anchor right to the seafloor. On the West Coast, we have a really big drop off on the continental shelf. So requires floating platforms. So the West Coast is a little earlier, earlier stages, but it's an important area. The wind speeds off of Cape Blanco and Cape Mendocino are really strong and really potentially high resource. The first auctions were done in California in December of 2022. And so those have been slowly working through the permitting process. There's also been a lot of work in developing the port infrastructure. I don't know if anyone's seen the wind turbines. They are very large pieces of machinery, require pretty particular development and port infrastructure. Continuing on the West Coast, Oregon has also been involved in this. Actually, I'm going to hide Lorren because I just realized Lorren is still blocking my slide. There we go. Lorren, you're still there. So in Oregon, this is about 3 years ago is when the call areas were initially announced. There had been some intergovernmental task force before then, but the Oregon process really in the public mind has been going on for the last 3 years. So the initial call areas are pictured here. Pretty large one for the Coos Bay call area, as well as further on the South Coast by Brookings. There's an analysis done to bring that down to the best possible resource and deal with conflicts with DoD. And so that resulted in these draft wind energy areas. And BOEM is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. They're the agency responsible for siting. They came and did public comment on the South Coast in September 2023, and it got a little contentious. There's been some pushback from community groups, particularly county commissioners and leadership, as well as from commercial fishing and tribes, particularly around just the process of site selection. Still, the process went forward. There was a proposed sale notice just about a year ago to lease these 2 tracks for offshore wind development. Went through some state level meetings as well in the summer. And then October is supposed to be the planned auction, but it got postponed due to a lack of competitive interest. There was only one bidder that was interested in pursuing a bid. So the plan had been to just delay and kind of push off and come back at another date. However, since January of this year, it's been a drastically different picture. On day 1 of the Trump administration, President Trump ordered a temporary withdrawal of all areas on the Outer Continental Shelf from offshore wind leasing. There's been some other actions around specific projects in New York, New Jersey, and Maine. But just this week, there has been even more developments. 17 states, including Oregon, California, and Washington, have come together to sue the Trump administration for blocking development of wind energy. This just came out this week. It's a very weird place to be working at for us. Every day we check the news to see what is developing. So just keep that in mind as we have these discussions. It's a very complex, ever-changing environment. Now, we've talked mostly at the federal level. The state also does have a role in this. Offshore wind is proposed in federal waters, but the state does have a regulatory role through the Coastal Zone Management Act. And in Oregon, that's done through the Department of Land Conservation and Development, DLCD. DLCD has taken on an expanded role too after some of this initial response and concerns about how offshore wind was being sited and developed. Different groups came together and kind of put together this report about having a roadmap to offshore wind. And that prompted House Bill 4080 last legislative session. Oof, that's a tough one to say. And so DLCD has been tasked with leading engagement for developing this roadmap for offshore wind development. It's an ongoing effort. It's been going for months now. Their next meeting is also next week, so hopefully it's not conflicting with the HMSC seminar, but I encourage you to engage, check out. It's in Brookings, but they also have it virtually. And there's been various working groups, but one that we're particularly interested in has been the focus on community benefits, because that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before I get into the new research, I just want to highlight some existing research we've been working on. Our group has been working in the marine energy, ocean renewable energy for a while. We had another grant through Department of Energy Water Power Technologies Office to do surveys of California, Oregon, and Washington residents about wave energy and offshore wind. And we found just 5 main perspectives to both energy technologies that are pretty consistent. There's this advocate perspective that is very pro-development, sees the benefits, doesn't really see so many risks of development. The largest cluster we saw was this cautious cluster. That's about 40% of people are slightly supportive of developing and leasing ocean renewable energy. they see the benefits, but they also see the risks and trying to balance that. There's also about 1 out of 5 respondents who are just pretty disengaged. It's pretty low salience for a lot of people as well. There's also a neutral perspective that's a little more informed, but still doesn't have a strong view, as well as the concern cluster, which is more opposed to development. But across all 5 clusters, those are really determined a lot by how people are perceiving the process and how they perceive trust in different entities like private energy developers and state and federal and local government. And so that heavily influences things. And just keep that in mind as we start talking about developing these community benefits around offshore wind. So I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Julia.
Thanks, Greg. So Greg, with that great overview and background of kind of the state of offshore wind, both federally and at the state level, and then especially with that last piece, what we've been learning about perceptions and their relationship to how folks engage with the process has really informed this project, which is what the rest of our talk's going to go into, the work that our team has been doing and is currently doing, focusing on community benefit agreements and offshore wind. So quick definition background, community benefit agreements, we're specifically talking about a type of benefit mechanism that is a legally binding contract between developers and communities or host municipalities, local community groups, that kind of thing. And they're generally considered meant to mitigate local impacts or potentially help improve things like social license or permission to act. So that's improving folks' perceptions about offshore wind and opinions about a given project, or reaching certain regulatory requirements about providing benefits to communities. They can also be pursued as a means of trying to improve trust and relationships with the community, or trying to improve the equity of distribution of outcomes, or potentially even a planning process. So it's a lot of expectations to put onto one type of benefit mechanism. And that's part of why we're interested in digging into more, why do these work, and how do folks view them, and how does that influence, how likely they are to be on board with offshore wind or not. We're going to keep saying CBAs and community benefit agreements, but very similar ones that you might have heard of are host community agreements or good neighbor agreements. If you've heard of project labor agreements or tribal benefit agreements, they are similar, but they do have distinct legal standing. So just to keep that in mind, that those are different community benefit mechanisms from what we're specifically going to be talking about. And after a brief review of the existing literature around doing community benefit agreements in offshore wind in the US, which is not a lot because it's a relatively new space, there's general consensus around some key principles for going into this kind of benefit agreement. So acknowledging that there are contextual specificities for a given community as far as socioeconomic, environmental contexts, and project conditions that would influence the agreement. And then things otherwise are really focused on process. So early and long-term discursive co-development is really just a fancy way of saying spend the whole time doing two-way communication and work collaboratively, and start that early on. And viewing and recognizing a community as hosts, or they're as much an actor in the agreement as a developer, and that there has to be an avenue for enforcing follow through and accountability, and making sure that what's agreed upon actually comes to fruition. But the details of how to get there are fuzzy, and there's not a clear existing regulatory map for that federally or state-wise. So that's part of why DLCD is interested in what might be like the policy area around community benefit agreements. And for our specific project, we're trying to dig into looking at the community benefit agreements that have already been put into place in offshore wind contexts in the US. So that's mostly in the Northeast. And then perceptions that communities and community members have of benefits and risks around community benefit agreements and offshore wind, and their preferences for certain types of benefits in those affected communities, and then how that relationship works between perceptions and preferences around benefit agreements and offshore wind. And the emphasis on those last two pieces is especially on rural, smaller coastal communities where floating offshore wind would happen. And those are areas that don't have offshore wind yet in the US. So broad research design has several phases. There's the first kind of getting us sense of the background, case studies of existing community benefit arrangements, and then interviews in 6 case communities that fit that, small coastal community where there would be floating offshore wind, followed by surveys in each of those same 6 communities, a second follow-up round of interviews in those same communities, and then, sharing out the products. And there's a lot that we're hoping to get out of this, but one thing that we're really prioritizing would be an information toolkit for communities and organizations, say, engage with developers in pursuing these kind of agreements. So for the rest of this presentation, we're really going to focus on that first stage because that's where we're wrapping up and pretty close to done with a lot of the work. So first, Taufiq's going to go over content analysis of documents about those existing community benefit agreements. That's his first chapter of his dissertation. So if you want to hear more, definitely tune into his defense next week. And then Emily and Lorren will talk about those interviews with communities and developers that have been a part of CBAs. So Taufiq, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you, Greg and Julia, for giving that wonderful presentation on community benefits and the context of offshore wind. So what I did in my first dissertation chapter is that I picked 13 CBA cases out of 17 CBA cases all across the East Coast and West Coast in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, and California. And I tried to do a thematic content analysis of the legal agreements and website summaries and the documents that are linked with these offshore wind CBAs. So my primary 3 research questions are: how have communities been defined in the US CBAs for offshore wind? I brought a theoretical framework. I utilized a theoretical framework from Europe where Rudolph and his colleagues used, and then tried to replicate it in the US context. And then I also looked into how benefits have been defined and what is the level of deliberative communication. I know Sarah is here, who worked on deliberative communication, which means repeated communications between different stakeholders, whether the municipalities or the state entities or the different community groups alongside with the developers. So here are the list of the documents which I have done a thematic analysis from. Again, they include legal agreements. If I do not find legal agreements, then I relied on website summaries and BOEM lease documents, public comments, plan presentations, and local media coverage. And these informations were collected from the towns or municipalities who signed the negotiations with the developers. So here are 13 cases. Here you can see that there are certain cases which are community benefit agreements signed with the communities who are hosting the cable landings and substations required for the offshore wind turbines. And there are certain cases where communities such as South Brooklyn and in New London and in Salem, they are hosting the offshore wind marine terminals or reconstruction of the marine terminals for turbine staging. So I have done a content analysis of 207 documents, including the legal agreements signed for this CBS. So what we see a particular pattern among the CBS. The Brookhaven and Suffolk community, which is in New York, received the largest amount of benefit payment. And Barnstable, which signed a offshore wind CBA or host community agreement with the Vineyard Wind developers, the Avangrid and Copenhagen International parties, they came as second. So 2 of the biggest offshore wind community benefit payers are Ørsted and Avangrid, and there are also Crowley and Equinor who also signed benefit agreements with the nearby communities. So the general payments actually include the annual payments that can stretch from 15 years to 35 years. And it also includes one-time, two-time payments. Sometimes they are known as milestone payments. And then there is this targeted payments, which includes sector-wise payment distributions, probably money going to the educational partnership or apprenticeship programs, supply chain development, or job creation or workforce development, or other benefit arrangements. So here's the breakdown of the different benefit arrangements. I'm not going to go in details of this very crowded table. What we can see is that the direct payment, community funds, and tax earnings are monetary benefits. The job creation and local hiring, they come as non-monetary benefits. But local infrastructure, supply chain, public space restoration, and educational partnerships, they can be monetary and non-monetary in nature. So there is the visual depiction of that particular themes. We see a common pattern among most of the CBS, the direct payments, which also includes blanket payments, annual direct payments, not very specified, or one-time, two-time payments, emerge as the highest themes among the CBS. And there are targeted community funds, which also include blanket funds. And then educational partnerships, investments for local infrastructure and supply chain and public space restoration, which includes investments for parks, recreation center, or senior centers, or schools, or hospitals. Those are those type of fundings. And then job creation, tax earnings, and indirect benefits came later. Moving into how these community benefits have been negotiated, we see a overwhelming majority of the community benefits were actually signed with the municipalities, but there were certain benefit agreements where nonprofit or third-party organizations were accompanied with the municipalities, and then they helped negotiate those offshore wind CBAs with the developers. There are certain cases, particularly in Salem and Brookhaven and Suffolk, where these nonprofit organizations played a significant role. They helped the community to form up some community wish list and raise the voice of the community to make a very well-specified community benefit agreement, sign a very sector-wise divided benefit agreements with the developers. So the next thing, I try to weight these monetary benefit payments with the median household income of that particular community. We see a general pattern. The green ones are basically the communities who are hosting the cable landings and substations. And the red ones are hosting the offshore wind marine terminals. The blue one is basically hosting both. And the violet one is not hosting anything, but living in proximity to the offshore wind turbines. But if you closely look into that figure, what you will see is that those communities who are relatively well off are receiving the largest benefit payments. So this is one of the important findings. Well, of course, the benefit payments are linked with the type of infrastructure they're hosting or they are living in proximity to those infrastructures. But relatively well-off communities are receiving the highest benefit payments. While deliberative communication is very important, and the nonprofit organizations or third parties can play a key role, but if they cannot increase the benefit payment amount, but their involvement can certainly help a particular community to make the CBS very specific. So what we have seen throughout these 13 CBS is that where the nonprofit and third-party groups are involved during the negotiation process, the deliberative communication level was much higher than those CBS where the nonprofits were not very involved. So those CBS became very, very specific in comparison to those CBS which did not involve these third parties or nonprofit organizations. So the overall key finding is that payments vary widely in scope and complexity, depending on the type of infrastructure they host, to what extent that impact the culture, heritage, and the viewshed factors. And larger payments result from community wealth and nature of hosting infrastructures. And nonprofits can influence payment specifics and amplify diverse voices. I will hand over the next presentation to Emily to give you more details.
as well as Lorren. Lorren
Hello.
can.
Yeah. Hi. Hi, folks. Lorren here. You're hearing me on a speaker if you're in person, and you can see me and hear me on your screen if you're over Zoom. Emily and myself are going to be presenting some very preliminary findings and insights from our interviews with developers, local government, and community actors. And so our work is nestled in that first part of the research design that Julia presented, where we have interviewed, again, community members and offshore wind developers, as well as local government officials who have engaged in community benefit mechanism negotiations. And so we spoke again with those folks, and our participants really ranged in geography, but given the phase of development really on the East Coast, most of our interviews for our work were associated with projects that are on the East Coast. I'll be using the language of community benefit mechanisms just to capture the different kinds of agreements that we discussed, including CBAs, good neighbor agreements, host community agreements, and tribal benefit agreements. And so the interview team, including myself and Emily, we spoke with 21 offshore wind developers, 11 folks within local government, and 8 community actors who have already participated in the community benefit process within offshore wind energy development. And so in the interviews, they really shared their perspectives, insights, lessons learned within the negotiation process. And so these are the perspectives that we'll be bringing you today. Just to reiterate again that the content that we will be presenting is very exploratory and preliminary. We're still trying to figure out how we want to compare our findings from these interviews, the lens that we want to see them through. But here's what we're noticing so far. There are really, really important differences and nuances in how these different actors really understand and experience offshore wind development and those community benefit mechanisms. And so those different experiences really shape the perspectives of trust and how transparent they think they are and how they feel the outcomes are. And so we'll talk about each of these a little bit more. Just to kind of say at the top, our participants shared that misinformation and disinformation is a shared challenge for them, and that it's possible that third-party actors like Taufiq just brought up, such as trusted organizations and NGOs, really have the potential to fill some of the gaps in the process.
Okay. And so as we started analyzing our interviews, Lorren and I really wanted to put what we were hearing from broader community actors, from developers, and from local government leaders into conversation with each other, so to speak. And what really stood out was how differently each party saw its own role and each other's role around public engagement and the development and negotiation of community benefits. There doesn't seem to be much understanding of what community benefit mechanisms are supposed to do. For some, CBMs are more of a community engagement tool, and for others, it's about mitigation and compensation. And these different interpretations create fundamental misalignments about what the what, the why, the who, the when of engagement and benefits. So we're seeing how these relationships in this triangle up here are shaped by mismatched expectations and misunderstandings, and it's creating tension even when everyone is working towards perceived positive outcomes. In the next few slides, we're going to dig into these relationships a little bit more and see how their understandings diverge, what that means for community benefits overall, and finally, for the sake of this framework, I think it's important that local government is represented by the elected and non-elected officials that we talk to. And then communities are represented by our interviewees from NGOs, advocacy groups, and we're involved in community organizing, outreach, and community benefits overall. So first, for local government perspectives, we're realizing that the local governments often find themselves kind of stuck in the middle between negotiating with developers behind closed doors and managing public expectations. As one official explained, we don't generally negotiate contracts in public. This is no different. And they aim to make competitive deals and build partnerships with developers. At the same time, they perceive developers as really well-resourced and powerful actors. And this imbalance in resource was reflected a lot in comments around capacity including time, expertise, money. And then at the same time as they're balancing their work with the developers, local government leaders are trying to meet the needs of their residents. But community engagement often took a back seat to standard business operations and was often not approached in a way that felt meaningful to the community or even substantive. And the public felt, quote, the public felt like we weren't trying to work in their best interest. There was no process where we were constantly talking with our public. So leaders did acknowledge gaps in how, when, and how much they engaged with their community. And this was definitely the case for the earlier CBAs that we spoke to. Local governments also tend to take a contractual mindset, focusing on direct payments or funds, which aligns with what Taufiq just shared. In offshore wind projects, we find this balancing act a tricky one for local government. However, their approach, it really does impact the benefits that communities see, and then also who gets a say at the table. For the community perspective, community members really want to be heard. They want to see direct benefits, and they want to feel included in the decisions that affect them. You can see from that quote at the beginning, it says, "The voters and I should have some say in what is going on." Communities see developers as distant and powerful actors and are skeptical of their motives. And when engagement between developer and a community does happen, it can be perceived by the community as more of a sales pitch than a genuine conversation. That said, when developers do bring on trusted local liaisons to work with community, it's received a lot more positively. And community members really want to be informed and involved in the community benefit mechanism development from the beginning. They look to their local leaders to bring them in and facilitate that. And when engagement from the local government is either delayed, limited, or perceived to be behind closed doors, it's understood as them failing to act in the public's best interest. And when they are meaningfully included, the community brings really creative, non-monetary focused benefit ideas that are grounded in local values and local priorities, which again kind of echoes what we heard from Taufiq's findings too. And I'm pointing to that last quote where it says, "We have ideas, and if we're going to get a big pot of money, we have things we want."
And so then from a developer's perspective, they're often relying on city governments and local governments to manage community relationships, specifically within the community benefit process, which can ultimately backfire, as we kind of just heard, when communities feel excluded from that benefit process. But however, developers are somewhat understandably really motivated to ensure elected officials support their project. And so you can see here that, of course, they want to have the relationship with the cities, but there are sometimes gaps between what the city wants and what the community members want. And how that plays out can really impact the way that communities perceive developers, projects, benefits, and impacts from those projects. And so, developers shared that they took a back seat in those scenarios when they noticed those gaps, saying things like, the city said that it'll be between the city and the developer, but there was an outcry from this community, and I stepped back because it wasn't my place. And so they really take a back seat in sort of understanding that, these local government officials have constituents that they have to answer to, and they have an opportunity to kind of take a step back so they can kind of figure out their next steps. And so developers, are feeling a little bit stuck because, they hear from these communities that, they say things like the money may go directly to the city, and then the community feels like the money never trickles down, but it's really ultimately up to the city. And so developers are, again, kind of feeling a little stuck in those moments because at the end of the day, the agreements that we're talking about will be between developers and the municipalities, those local government officials. And so actors in these community benefit processes have very different views around expectations of what the benefits are. And so these views really depend on who gets what, who is deciding how much they get, and how open that process is. And so developers are feeling like communities are expecting really large windfalls, really like large sums of money. But local governments are struggling with this idea that they're not really sure what they're allowed to ask for. They're not, it's hard to tell what you deserve in their words. And then communities are really left feeling like the pot of money isn't much compared to what could be or really what it should be. And then developers are again feeling like, you know, the expectation is for them to solve all of the problems of society. But communities are feeling like their asks are coming from these very thoughtful specific places. And local governments are trying to understand what is possible and the timing of what those possibilities are. And then actors, you know, in the process are also trying to decipher what their role is in the process, but also within the general community and who their role is to the other actors in the process. And so developers were questioning the fairness of the ask for them to solve various issues within communities. Like, you know, I don't know that it's really fair to ask developers to solve various issues of environmental degradation. You know, where's the state government? And so they're often, you know, left wondering what their role is and what it should be and what it shouldn't be. Whereas local governments are feeling like their role is confusing and may not be fair because they don't have enough information to start the process and they're operating with limited information. And then communities are also feeling like it isn't fair and they don't know their role because they don't feel like they're super active participants in the process. And so really what we see is this process and all of the actors within it are really confused and somewhat disgruntled about what their role is and kind of feeling like the process isn't helping them in some way or another.
And as Lorren pointed out earlier, we have identified misinformation and disinformation as a shared challenge that was brought up frequently by each of the actors that we interviewed. I wanted to share these slides and I'm happy to talk about it more at the end during Q&A, but for the sake of time, we're going to move on to the important role that third parties are playing. And here, third parties are represented by NGOs, advocacy groups, legal counsel, consultants with technical expertise, and university partnerships. And as Taufiq is finding too, they play a critical role in offshore wind processes by facilitating information sharing, collecting, organizing, and distributing credible information, as well as advocating for their communities. And community trust in offshore wind processes depends not just on what is being said, but who is saying it. And we consistently heard that developers are not seen as credible messengers, and that also these federal and state processes that communities are sorting through are confusing and they're fragmented. And this combination creates skepticism and it makes it harder for both communities and local governments to be able to engage meaningfully around these benefit mechanisms. The community-based organizations and NGOs, especially those with the strong local relationships, are stepping in where the developers and the local governments are falling a bit short. They translate, contextualize, and in many cases, they're lending credibility to information to communities. And we've seen third parties filling several key roles that are up here on the screen. As conveners, they bring stakeholders together across sectors and they create spaces for discussion. As honest brokers, they help explain these technical processes in ways that make sense locally and also foster more participation. We've also heard them very attentive to this importance of who information is coming from. As community advocates, they're bringing community interests not just to local government or to the developers, but they're also bringing it to state and federal entities at times. And then as capacity builders, this is happening in numerous ways. They support communities in accessing and participating in community benefit processes. They have even supported developers in the developers outreach to community, as you can see in that last quote. And then additionally, going back to the mention of municipality capacity to engage in the process, they're filling this role too, particularly through offering specific technical expertise, whether that's in major contract negotiation or even legal counsel. So where does this leave us? We see that there are real differences in how these different parties understand and experience offshore wind development and CBMs, and those differences are shaping trust and shaping outcomes. Overall, there's confusion and disagreement around what community benefits should look like and who's responsible for what. And we're seeing the third party stepping in and playing a really essential role to the process. Next, Lorren and I are going to look further into these expectations and roles of CBMs and how they function in the broader policy landscape. We want to understand what's expected and how they're expected to be delivered, and how these expectations align or don't align with reality. And I'm going to pass it back over to Julia.
Thanks, Emily and Lorren. We mentioned that Taufiq is defending next week, but Lorren is also presenting her work pretty soon as she's getting ready to graduate. And so if any of you are interested in digging a little deeper specifically into those developer interviews, definitely reach out to her. It's really, really cool work. With the time that's left, I'm going to jump back in and talk about what we're working on now and what's coming up. And then tie our threads together, all the different pieces that we've talked about, and hopefully have some more time for questions. So I mentioned earlier that stage 2 is interviews, community interviews, and talking about communities where offshore wind would be floating if it were to come in the future. So these are areas where it's deeper water, there isn't necessarily infrastructure in place yet, but there's some amount of planning in process, or has been up to this point. So we've got 2 sites, each in Oregon and Maine, and then 1 site each in Washington and California. And we're interviewing primarily community leads. So these are folks who either fit that local government title that Emily mentioned earlier, or folks who play a really prominent role in their community. They are showing up on behalf of their fellow fishers or seafood processors in local meetings. They are part of their local environmental groups or different kinds of social advocacy, or maybe they're part of their local port development or other types of infrastructure groups. So we're trying to get a diverse sense of perspectives within these interviews, and we're asking them about their understanding of offshore wind potential benefits and impacts, and then digging into that question about benefits and what kinds of needs their community has. Do they view benefit arrangements and things like community benefit agreements as a means of potentially acquiring them, and how that ends up relating back to how they're feeling about offshore wind. And we're getting really close to done with the interviews in California, Washington, and Coos Bay, Oregon. And then Brookings, we're getting close, and Maine is a little further behind. So while we're leaning on our team with colleagues at University of Washington, Cal Poly Humboldt, and University of Maine to do the interview efforts at those various sites, I've been leading the interview effort for Oregon. So keep in mind, this isn't like official findings. We're very early in an analysis stage. This is patterns that we're starting to see emerge coming out of the transcripts, and things that we're starting to hear echo in other states as well. So interviewees talk a lot about fairness, about the process, and of outcomes, both of offshore wind and hypothetical benefit agreements. But there's a lot of different perspectives on what that should look like, who should be at the table, who should manage the agreement, that kind of thing, when it should start, how big of an effort it should be, whether that should be all monetary versus all programmatic agreements or other types of things. So there's a mix of preferences for the how and the what of those agreements. But there's a lot of alignment around the issues that come with not having a lot of capacity in these communities, and how a lot of folks are wearing multiple hats and they play a lot of roles already, and it's hard to imagine taking on one more thing. And also, in some cases, a lack of expertise, where this scale of development with this kind of benefit agreement might be a little less familiar. There's a lot of concern, or sometimes apprehension or just dismissal of benefit agreements as something that is a developer tool and a payoff or a bribe to get folks to just not be a problem and not oppose a development effort. So there's a mix of opinions about how realistic a benefit agreement might actually be as a useful tool. But there is a shared want for greater policy-driven support from the state. So, and that is something that, as we mentioned earlier, DLCD is trying to figure out what that might look like. And there's shared openness to alternatives that might better fit the community context and priorities, whether that's alternative energy developments than offshore wind or alternative benefit mechanisms. And so there's a consistent reference, especially in Oregon, these coastal southern Oregon towns listing issues of housing, social and health services, employment opportunities, and education as really areas of major need. And a want to see growth in industry development and a recognition that energy redundancy is a part of the piece, a part of the picture for what that might look like. But, apprehension about whether offshore wind is the right fit in that sense. So we're really excited to dig into the analysis a little bit deeper with these interviews and start comparing across the different sites. And then what's coming up this summer is a survey effort using a drop-off pickup approach. And we're happy to talk more about what that actually looks like in each of those 6 communities. I'll highlight that Greg has been helping to actually figure out the details of the stratification of sampling. So he's a great person to ask more about the planning that's going into that. And that's going to take us through the summer. As far as what I want us to make sure that we're taking away from today and try to link all these different pieces together. And we heard from Taufiq's work especially that there can be a lot of variety of what benefit agreements can look like. But there are trends that we're starting to see about what influences the size of monetary allocation and how specific those agreements are. So when you start planning who's involved in that process, the community capacity and wealth, and then how community input is considered and incorporated. And we're hearing similar themes coming out of Emily and Lorren's work. So really emphasizing each other, which is cool to see alignment and contextuality from interviews alongside a text-based study. And then we're also learning how communities can potentially improve their ability to procure benefit agreements that address needs or mitigate impacts by having a clear definition of needs and expectations. Some of those interviews have really emphasized peer learning from other groups who have gone through CBA process to help build up that strategy. And then Taufiq, Lorren, and Emily have all talked about that role of the third party and especially advocacy groups and NGOs that can help on the community side strategically and effectively engage. And then, maybe these benefit agreements or different community benefit mechanisms might be able to actually influence perceptions about offshore wind. We are seeing a link between perceptions of offshore wind and perceptions of benefits agreements, but we're recognizing that there's some limitations given there's a lot of uncertainty and a lack of clarity around roles and responsibilities of involved actors, if not outright disagreement as far as perspectives. And some of that is related to there being a lack of a regulatory framework. Then again, a regulatory framework is hard to adjust to context specificity. So and then there's also this piece of it where, you might not have something that you can even start with if communities are coming from a position of viewing these as inherently unfair approaches. We have to also be continuously talking about other mechanisms that might be good avenues of community benefits. So with that, I'm going to finish up and hopefully we have some time for more questions. I'm going to invite the rest of our team up with me so that we can field your questions. Thanks so much for having us today.
All right. We'll get Lorren's face back up. Welcome back. You're on screen again. So we're going to open up for questions. I'm going to have our team just pass the mic back and forth and do the same here in the room. Roseanne, do you have any questions online yet? Okay, for folks online, go ahead and put any questions in the chat box. Chat box, not chat bot. And then for folks in the room, any questions for our team? Yeah, Sarah.
Feel like I'm living the academic dream because you cited my work. So I really appreciate that. I have one question and one more of a consideration for you. This is tangential, but I think connected. And I was wondering if in any of your conversations, the idea of who's going to benefit from this additional electricity and if it will actually contribute to decarbonization, or if it's just going to feed AI and big tech, if that consideration was present in any of the interviews that you did. So that's my first question. And then the second one is your language around monetary and non-monetary benefits is a little bit confusing because it's really all about flows of money. It's just maybe flows of money to municipalities directly that supports public goods like education, healthcare, community centers versus another flow of money. I was a little confused about the non-monetary benefit since it's really all about financial flows. Thanks.
I'll start. Yeah, that's a great piece of feedback because that's also been a point of like confusion when talking about it in interviews as well. So maybe we can think about programmatic investments as an alternate. It all comes down to numbers. We'll discuss. As far as your first question, for the interviews I've been doing, it has come up a few times. It's definitely not as prevalent a topic as I personally thought it might be. Folks do have strong feelings about it when it does come up, but it's not actually been that present. There is otherwise a recognition that a lot of these communities are in need of alternate or more reliable energy resources if they're at the far end of an energy line, right? And if pushed, like with the question of where they'd like to see the energy go, they would rather see it local. That's kind of the extent as far as the interviews I'm doing right now, but I pass it to Emily and Lorren.
Yeah, I would say it didn't come up nearly as much in my interviews as well. I would say more of the conversation was about discussion around impacted community and being able to see the wind farms, but not the cable landing in one state, but see it from another, and the electricity going to one state but another state having the view shed impact. So it was more kind of a discussion around that when we were talking about fairness, but I would agree with Julia. It didn't come up nearly as much as I thought it would.
Lauren, do you have anything to add or?
No, I would just say anecdotally, developers brought up our increasing energy consumption. Didn't cite anything specific, but just said that, offshore wind offers a opportunity to reach those sort of needs within the menu of energy sort of development generally. But there was nothing sort of specific around AI or data centers or anything like that.
We do have in the surveys, we're going to have some question about just where it's going in terms of what state the electricity is going to, urban center versus rural areas. So that's something that through the surveys, we're going to be able to look at a little bit through these cross sections, see how that relates to views of benefits and risks, and also some of their views about these community benefits as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Julia, for giving some clarification regarding the monetary and non-monetary benefits. So this is something where we try to conceptualize how to actually put what is considered as monetary benefit and what is considered as non-monetary benefits. So we used a little bit of literature from the Columbia University, New York's Sabin Center scholars, Webb and Eisenson. And also we looked into the Rudolph et al. And Patrick Devine-Wright's definitions of how to divide these benefit mechanisms. And they use these two terminologies: monetary benefits, which can be tangible, and non-monetary benefits, or less tangible or more distant, benefits. For instance, they specifically mention about job creation or local hiring as a non-monetary benefit. They used that particular terminology. But there are certain projects, for instance, like if an investment is going into like public space restoration for a recreation center or park and other senior centers, of course, there is money going into those sectors to develop those infrastructures, but they can have long-term benefits, which we cannot measure in terms of money. So that's why we use the terminology non-monetary, but certainly we can redefine the terminology to make it bring more clarity.
Great. Other questions in the room? All right, I'm gonna go for a little run to the very back, and you all get to hear me stomp up the stairs. Hang in there with me.
Hello, so I'm not familiar with the whole universe of the different mitigation or compensation spheres that happen with offshore wind. But what comes to mind is when I hear community benefits, it's sort of local community, the most affected community. But there's a lot of public benefits from birds and fish and whales that migrate and that may be impacted, the seafloor bottom that may be affected, certainly fishermen that, can't fish in an area because of the anchors. But is there a separate consideration for mitigation for the general impacts on public resources? Thank you.
I can give it a shot, and then I'll happily have team members add to. So there are other types of mitigation tools, right? There are things like fisheries compensation funds. There's a lot of other types of tools that are meant to move some amount of action or fund towards groups or issues that are related to negative impacts. And this is that conversation of trade-offs, right? And so when we're thinking about community benefit agreements, we're specifically talking about ensuring that benefits that would exist anyway go to a specific group, or creating new benefits that wouldn't otherwise be there, and try to make sure that that balance of trade-offs, positive and negative, are more favorable. Whether or not communities view that as realistically going to happen from these specific kind of agreements, that's a different conversation. But that is also part of why we're asking folks about benefits and impacts, and wanting to make sure that that conversation about the impacts is a part of how we're doing the work.
Clarify. Yeah, I mean, when we were reviewing all these contents, we thought about how to conceptualize the fishing mitigation and compensation funds. And there's some completely separate things. Like one of the big developer, Ørsted, they signed this fishing mitigation and compensation fund for their Sunrise Wind project, for their Revolution Wind project, and for their South Fork Wind project. And there is this another project, Vineyard Wind 1, which is also trying to come up with a fishing mitigation and compensation fund. And these funds are much larger because they cover a much larger area. But we couldn't find a particular theme that aligns with what we have seen in the host community agreements or the community benefit agreements or the good neighbor agreements. Therefore, we decided to keep them separate. But they are much more public in nature. They have compensations for the fishing communities who are probably losing a lot of fishing zones because the offshore wind turbines will be installed there. And the money, in terms of monetary value, Ørsted signed more than $150 million worth of fishing mitigation and compensation fund with Rhode Island CARMC and Massachusetts Coastal Management Zone. Sorry, very difficult to spell.
Yeah, but I'm talking the fishermen, I understand, but
Yeah.
what about the public benefits, the public benefits of healthy birds and fish communities and habitat?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think there are probably examples of where that's been attempted in certain cases. But to my knowledge, there isn't necessarily an existing consistent framework for approaching that. And this might be an area that is part of the conversation of what role does the state play? And is there an avenue for thinking through how we factor in things that might have some amount of inherent value, or, sometimes we use the word ecosystem services, things that are providing their own benefit that are a part of the picture, and keeping them in the balance. And maybe it's an avenue of what we might expect or ask of a state to be considering when they're playing some sort of policy role, managing a whether it's a community benefit agreement or other.
And I'll just chime in real quick. Some of this also happens through the lease process as well. In California, the California Coastal Commission had these stipulations that came as part of the lease, specifically around environmental monitoring and assessment. And so those are some things that can be included at the time of lease as well, and not necessarily through a CPA.
Right, we've got a question online. I want to make sure we get time for. Go ahead, Roseanne.
I was also just typing up an answer for somebody online, just in case we didn't get to it.
Yes, I see that. I'll move on to the next one. Who provides the monetary benefit and payment? In Oregon, the growth of data center farms has increased demand for electricity and water. These costs are being passed on to consumers. Could corporations not be included in these conversations around funding and benefits to communities?
Sure. Sorry, can you mind repeating the question real quick? I've lost in the middle part there. A thought popped in my head.
Who provides the monetary benefit and payment? In Oregon, the growth of data center farms has increased demand for electricity and water. These costs are being passed on to the consumers. Could corporations not be included in these conversations around funding and benefits to communities?
So a lot of the funds are coming directly from developers negotiating. So it's the developer negotiating with a community and trying to come up with an amount. Some of it is also coming through the lease process. This is something that BOEM kind of started doing iteratively through the lease auction, is using, so as different companies are bidding on this, tract out in the ocean, up to, I believe there are 10% or 20%. There's some for supply chain and workforce development, and then 5% bidding credits that were specifically targeted towards development of CBAs. So if you had, let's just say $100 lease payment, it's way more than that. But so then $5 of that would then be carved off and sent back and allowed for the developer to take that, instead of paying that to the U.S. Treasury, take that and use it towards a community benefit plan. So it's still coming from the developer. It's just redirecting instead of it going directly into the Treasury. So that's where some of it's coming from. But a lot of the ones that we've looked at and how they were negotiated were before that lease auction approach came through. I believe California, New York, I think had some as well. California was where they really started to increase it up to a maximum of 30% big bidding credits. Oregon, I think, they were retweaking the formula for when the Oregon auction would take place. It's just something that BOEM has been adapting to over time.
As far as the latter half of that question related to anticipating an increase in energy demand as a whole, that could be something that might be a part of the conversation that a community wants to keep in mind, if that's something that they're concerned about, as far as trying to maybe negotiate rate stabilizing or something. That might be something that they can talk about. More broadly, that brings up the point that offshore wind is just one piece of the potential picture of the various types of energy development that might be required to meet a growing energy need, and whether in a broader picture that is something that the state of Oregon does want to continue towards.
All right, everybody, we have run to our time limit, and I want to be respectful of those that have other places they need to be. But I'm going to ask if our speakers can stick around for just a second. And Lorren, if you are answering questions online and you still see them, it looks like we still have got some other questions. Feel free to continue. We'll keep that going for just a little bit more. Appreciate that. But for everybody that's here right now, can we just do one more round of applause for this amazing group? All right, I hope to see you next week, either here or possibly at Defenses, if that is where we need to go. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. So Lauren, thanks so much for putting in those answers. We appreciate you helping us on the online side.
No problem.
You can't see it and you can't see all of us, but thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. There is a whole circle of folks that are surrounding your other presenters. So they might not have a chance to
Oh my
wrap up
goodness.
with you.
Oh, great. Okay, well, that's good. I'm glad that folks are interested. I'll head out then. Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. But thank you so much. And then I will send Greg the information about how many folks were here and the link to today's talk. So you'll get that through him.
Great. Sounds good. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Just popped in.
The person that asked the tribal question, if you stick online for a second, I'll see if I can get you an answer. Hang in there. If you're still on there, there was a question online about the surveys and whether you're going to survey tribal members.
We're not going to specifically target tribal members. They could come up through the survey approach, but the sampling approach is going based on residential parcels. So we're taking county level data about where we can get data of saying, okay, this is single family home zone residential. This is 2 to 4 units. We're taking that, limiting just to residential parcels, and then taking census block groups and selecting them randomly. So we're clustering in a way just for the ease of people walking on foot to get around and do all these surveys and administer the surveys. So we're hoping we get tribal members through it, but we're not specifically targeting tribal groups.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody online. We're going to wrap up on this end. If you have any questions, you can reach out to our presenters specifically, and you can rewatch the recording in a few days on the Hatfield website. Thanks, everyone.